Hi, my name is Shant, and like many osteopaths, I am an osteobaiter. Osteobation has probably been around for generations. However, it has been quite taboo. Finally, in the 21st century, we have come to a time where it is socially acceptable to begin discussing the very issue of osteobation. Osteobation is defined as the manipulation of oneself in the osteopathic manner. For instance, the osteobation of the cervical spine is done like so. This documentary will hopefully get to the crux of osteobation. Let's see what we found.
Osteobation? I love it. It's great. I do it all the time.
So Ben, do you osteobate?
Not as much as I deserve.
Do you osteobate?
I do, Sean.
Osteobation? Hell, I love it. I do it every day, sometimes in the student lounge.
Do you osteobate?
Sean, that's a beaner's question.
I wish I knew how to osteobate.
What is that?
We don't osteobate. We have someone to do it for us.
Sometimes I even osteobate in the shower.
How frequently do you osteobate?
At least, what, 2-3 times a day?
Yeah, I really like osteobating in the morning and before bed.
Yeah, sometimes in the middle of the day.
How often do you do it?
I'd say on a good day, probably 4 to 6 times a day.
Boy, it's hard to say. It's got to be at least 3 or 4 times a day.
And how often do you osteobate?
Every day, probably every day.
Really depends on how stressful the week is.
How many other osteopaths do you think osteobate on a regular basis?
You know what? I have my own guesses. I would say probably 95%. Another 5% are either answering the phone or taking the survey.
How many actually do or how many would admit to it?
I would think in our class, at least 60%.
I think everyone osteobates, and if they say no, they're probably lying.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Dr. Lisa taught us how to osteobate in OMM clinics, so...
Well, how many osteopaths do you think osteobate?
Well, if they're smart, I think all osteopaths should osteobate.
So you guys are roommates. Do you ever osteobate together?
It's usually the only way we do it.
Do you guys ever osteobate with each other?
Sometimes, but the beauty of osteobation is you don't need anyone else to do it with.
Why don't you show me your favorite osteobation technique?
The lumbar one is the best one. First, you have to get on the ground.
How do you like to osteobate?
Well, typically I like to start out slow at first.
And then I just bring one leg over like this.
You try to isolate the tissues, trying to get them right where you want them.
Wow, sounds like that was pretty good for you.
Yeah, I've gotten pretty good at it.
Now, let's take a closer look at how osteobation affects the ability of an osteopath to manipulate others.
You know, I think it's really enhanced our manipulation between the two of us.
Yeah.
How do you think osteobation has affected your manipulation of other people?
You know, I found that the more that I osteobate, the better I get at working with others.
I think so too. I think it's really important that you know how to manipulate yourself before you try to manipulate somebody else.
I think the practice with osteobation allowed me better tactile skills.
Practice makes perfect, they say.
This osteobation, is it morally correct for us to osteobate?
Do you have a moral dilemma with osteobation?
Not at all. I mean, some people do. Some people say it's wrong. You know, some people are crazy, I think.
Of course not. I think everyone should do it.
As far as I can, my vision has not been affected by repetitive osteobation.
I would never do it in front of small children.
Osteobation is a perfectly natural process. In fact, I do it almost every day, sometimes twice.
Do you have any moral problem osteobating?
Really, it's part of my osteopathic philosophy.
Do you have a moral dilemma with osteobation at all?
You know, I've been confronted on it before, but I've come to the conclusion that no, I think it's right and good and healthy for your body.
I hope this film has provided some sort of guide for further dialogue on the once taboo subject of osteobation.